Okay, we'll get started. So good afternoon and thank you for joining us for this webinar on supporting LGBTIQ plus refugees and vulnerable migrants in settlement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we are all on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would now like to welcome and introduce our incredible guest speakers today. So firstly, we have Tina Dixson. Tina is a feminist academic and policy professional who has worked in the areas of LGBTIQ, refugee and women's rights. Tina is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, researching lived experiences of LGBTIQ asylum seeking and refugee women in Australia. She is a co-founder and chair of the Forcibly Displaced People Network, the first organisation in Australia to work on the issues of LGBTIQ plus forced displacement. Thank you, Tina, and we look forward to hearing from you shortly. We also have Nadine Liddy. Nadine is the National Manager for Multicultural Youth Advocacy Network, MYAN. Nadine has worked in the youth and multicultural sectors for almost 3 decades and is a passionate advocate for refugee and migrant youth rights. With extensive experience in forced migration, settlement and youth work, her expertise sits across policy, advocacy, service delivery and sector development in the Australian and global context. So thank you, Nadine, as well for joining us today. Tina will be speaking on the key vulnerabilities for LGBTIQ plus refugees and vulnerable migrants, and we'll share some best practice approaches for settlement providers to use, while Nadine will provide insights and considerations for supporting LGBTIQ plus young people. Before I ask Tina to start, I would just like to remind you all that we will have an opportunity for questions at the end and ask that you please send these through at any time through the question box. I would now like to welcome Tina to the virtual floor. Thank you, Tina. And yes, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Samantha, and thanks everybody for joining the webinar today. I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of non-Ngambri people down here in the ACT, and then pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to be sharing slides with you today. Okay, so that should be working, right? So as Samantha said, I am a chair of the Forcibly Displaced People Network. We were registered earlier this year as the first LGBTIQ plus refugee-led organization. And so I'll talk you through the experiences that LGBTIQ plus people who have been forcibly displaced go through in Australia, and I will frame that through the settlement standards outcomes to make it relevant to your work and to show what progress still has to be achieved to make those settlement experiences really successful. So before we begin, I want to frame, I guess, so we're all on the same page. I wanted to say that LGBTIQ plus people have existed in all cultures and societies across history. So regardless, which context we take, gender and sexual diversity was always there in place. There is nothing new there, and what we have to be doing is recognizing that and supporting, because it's not that people are different because they're LGBTIQ, it is the systemic issues that are in place that create barriers for them to live their lives to the fullest potentials, whether in their home countries or when they are resettled. So a little bit of a background about FDPN. So this work has started in around 2017. I mean, I came to Australia with my wife in 2012, and we got protection visas in 2013. But then from 2017, we started focusing a lot more on the activism in the LGBTIQ plus refugee spaces, recognizing how there was not enough support going on, there was no services available, and there was no conversations about this particular group. So in 2017, I started my PhD research, and as a part of that, I was working with a group of queer asylum seeking and refugee women. And in 2018, we organized the first ever retreat And these women who were at that moment living in New South Wales, Victoria and ACT were able to meet themselves, each other for the first time, and to have this space for the community building and just sharing similar experiences. And that year also is the year of founding of the Queer Sisterhood project, which I'll speak really briefly next. In 2019, some of you may have attended the Queer Displacement Conference, which is the first conference in Australia to exclusively talk about LGBTIQ plus forced displacements. And we envision that work, that conference will happen every 2 years. We've also presented at the Global Refugee Forum, specifically highlighting the plight of LGBTIQ plus refugees. And then in 2020, we formalized all of this work by registering an NGO, Forcibly Displaced People Network. So at Forcibly Displaced People Network, we work towards a world where LGBTIQ plus people who have experienced forced displacements are included in societies and are safe, free, and supported. And so we do that by helping the community to live their life to the fullest potential. We provide a lot of referrals, information, some various degree of financial assistance. We also build services capacity to be inclusive in their approaches and policies towards this particular group. And also we help create intersectional and gender responsive policies. So you may notice how I use the language of LGBTIQ plus people who have been forcibly displaced. And I do it for a number of reasons, because I think this group is slightly different from, I guess, very common sense of how we think refugees are in terms of the pathways to Australia in this case. So we work with people who have been subjected to anti-LGBTIQ plus persecution and who, for example, have been resettled to Australia. We also include in these people who have come to Australia fleeing other types of persecution, but also are LGBTIQ plus persons. And this would include those young people who, for example, were resettled with their families early on, when they were children, and then later they will come out as LGBTIQ plus in Australia. Also work with those who come to Australia and seek asylum on shore. Those who had other pathways to leave their countries of origin. And I think this is one of the gaps that is always not many organizations are addressing, is that, and I'll talk on the next slide a little bit about the state of LGBTIQ rights in the world, but you do have people who will never be able in their countries of origin to live lives to the fullest potential, to be safe from discrimination, to have equal opportunities, but yet they have a little bit of more capacity or resources to migrate or to go as students to other countries and then try to stay through those pathways. And also then it includes those who have been trafficked or are undocumented. So before FDPN was formalized as FDPN, we did a lot of work through the Queer Sisterhood project, which was a very specific project to work with LGBTIQ plus refugee women. If you go on the link on our website, last year we've developed a cartoon, which was completely co-designed process with women in the group who talk about their experiences, both of life before Australia and then in Australia, and how they want to be supported. And we also developed a brochure that consists of a lot of useful tips and tools for services in terms of making sure that their service provision is inclusive. And on this link, you'll be able to go and get the report from the Queer Displacement Conference. We outlined the methodology in terms of co-design and centrality of the lived experience at such events, which you may find useful in your work, as well as there is a list of issues that LGBTIQ plus people are experiencing in their journey to safety. One of the other policy things that we are doing, which some of you may be familiar, is the Canberra Statement. So this is the policy guide that was developed during the conference by myself, Renee Dixson, and Eliana Rubashkin from Rainbow Pass New Zealand. And we are asking individuals and stakeholders to sign up to those documents. And your sign up to the document means that you are affirming the rights of LGBTIQ plus people seeking asylum and refugees to safety and justice. And then you, as a service, can choose those particular parts that are in your power to improve or change within your services, and you can work on those ones. So at the moment, we've got 80 organizations who sign up from 9 countries. And later in the year, we're going to be holding a webinar to talk a bit about it more. So a little bit more to the topic, just a quick background on the state of LGBTIQ+ rights around the world. So as of March 2019, we still have quite a lot of countries that criminalize consensual same-sex acts. Some would be criminalizing in particular male sexuality, some would be criminalizing both, and that criminalization would vary. So we have 6 member states that may impose death penalty on consensual same-sex sexual acts, and in addition of 5, it is a possibility. It is less enforced, but it is definitely a possibility. In 57, it's imprisonment, somewhere from 8 up to 8 years, and somewhere from 10 to life. But I think what's important to always remember that regardless of the state of legislation, the impact of patriarchy, societal and familiar pressures very often deprives people of opportunities to live their lives to the fullest potential. And one of the examples is, for example, Mexico. In Mexico City, marriage equality is legalized, yet they have the highest murder rates across Latin America when it comes to trans women and LGBTIQ+ people in general. So just having legislation doesn't mean that the societal attitudes shift that quickly, or that legislation for protection in particular is enforced. And so we see a lot of people fleeing various contexts, both the countries where there is explicit legislation and also countries where there are none. So at the moment at FDPN, our members come from pretty much every part of the world, obviously with the exception of Western countries. So I wanted to frame today's conversation in terms of the settlement outcomes, and to think through what can services do to make sure that this particular group has equitable access to everything else and any other client within your organization. And I find this, I guess, helpful thing to think through the lens of independency, acceptance, and security. So when we think through independency, we think that people have access to education, language classes, equal job opportunities. And I want to think, is it so for LGBTIQ+ persons, or are there additional barriers that we need to be addressing? Same goes for acceptance. Are LGBTIQ+ people visible within your services? Do they know they can safely access your services? And is there a validation of their experiences? One of the main things that we hear when people approach our organization is that they just want to know that their lives are legitimate, that their lives matter. They do not see themselves represented that much within Australian context, whether within services or media or general narratives, and that really contributes to a sense of isolation. And they want to know that they're not alone on this journey. And I think this is one of the major things that FDPN does, is provide that space of belonging for them. And then lastly, is the question of security. I guess Australia very often, or in general in the context of migration and resettlement, Australia is presented as this safe haven, a land of opportunities, but we have to be questioning, are LGBTIQ+ persons safe in here, regardless whether they have protection visa or they're still in a process of asylum? And again, what are those structural barriers that prevent for that safety to be true? So obviously you're all aware with the settlement outcomes, the only addition we separate when we talk about the issue, we add specifically orientation to the mix, because there's a couple of things there that not necessarily mentioned in others. And today I will only make you examples and talk through some of these ones, but not all. So when it comes to the orientation, I think one of the really important things that we always want to reiterate is the idea of visibility of LGBTIQ+ people, and not necessarily just the LGBTIQ+ people, but within those culturally linguistically diverse communities, within migrant and refugee communities. And I could make you some of the examples. So for example, if we look through the DSS, Department of Social Services brochure, Beginning a Life in Australia, there's no mention there at all that LGBTIQ+ people exist, or that their rights are equal to anybody else in this country and have to be upheld. Same happens in English classes, whether you go through places like Navitas or TAFE, or within services, those conversations are rarely held. And that has this flow-on effect that a lot of the time, services that are not specifically working with LGBTIQ plus people will not have those resources or referral pathways tailored, so they are not necessarily talking to people that, you know, if you are in need of your community or to talk to someone who understands you, this is where you can go. We've seen a lot of examples with people who we work with where it's really challenging, for example, for them to use counselors within settlement services, because regardless of, I guess, the expertise of the counselor, the client themselves are not aware whether that counselor will be inclusive and will not be judgmental and will be supporting. So we've done some, this is the images from the brochures that I said before, and a lot of people, they say that when I walk through the doors, I need to know that I will be supported and respected. And many people are refraining from using a lot of services that work with migrant and refugee populations, unless the service explicitly says that they will be supporting LGBTIQ plus people, because a lot of people come from the background where you're really distrusting authorities, including services where you've been really persecuted and discriminated your whole life simply being who you are. And so they need to know that they're going to be safe when accessing that particular service. So education and training is also another area that sometimes, regardless of, you know, how much we say that we have English classes that are available for everyone, that people need to make sure that those spaces are really safe. So we've had examples where in English classes, you know, another fellow student would ask you, so did you come here with alone or with your husband? And you would respond, oh no, I came here with my wife. And that person would just stand up and go to another table and like sit at the end of the class. And I think this is happening quite a lot, many times to us in particular, and in many, almost in all cases, teachers were never really equipped to deal with that. There was no real conversation to talk about the equality of rights and, you know, stuff like that in Australia. And I think it's really damaging for people because they come to Australia thinking that this discrimination has finished, and yet you know, they still end up being subjected to it. We've also seen in many cases where educational institutions in particular are not necessarily aware of those unique challenges that LGBTIQ plus people experience. And when universities, for example, would request a person to email back their universities in their home countries asking for explanation of their grades or some additional documents. And I think this is where people do not understand that quite often LGBTIQ plus people could have been human rights activists in their country and they were really visible. And so for them to come back to their university is really about disclosure of their current location and potentially putting their families or colleagues or even themselves at risk of further violence or being tracked down where they are at the moment. And I think those approaches to that have to be really sensitive, but people are still not necessarily know all of the details and nuances on how to be supporting this particular cohort. So when it comes to employment, I think this is one of the areas as well where a lot of discrimination is happening. And so I've got a quote here that says, at work, one of the Australian workers used to bully my partner every time she had her hair cut. He would say, why do you cut your hair? You look like a boy. And I think this is so particularly true for people, regardless, you know, where you work, there is still a lot of prejudices and bullying happening within the workplaces. And this is probably, you know, not new, but in general, what we tend to see with people from refugee backgrounds, that they're more reluctant to make those complaints for fear of losing the employment or for fear of the repercussions. And very often, especially when they are in informal employment or casual and precarious work, they're really afraid that if they're going to make a complaint about that, they will definitely lose their shifts. For LGBTIQ plus people, especially if they're not out at work and if they're only being perceived for being LGBTIQ plus, making a complaint would mean that they will have to disclose who they are and potentially put them in a really unsafe situation at work for them, and so people choose not to do that. There are also particular barriers for trans people, especially for those ones whose documents still reflect their dead name and incorrect gender, because in Australia, to be able to change your name and to change your gender marker, there's a little bit of process depending on the state and territory. And in some states, for example, for name change, you have to reside in that particular state for 3 years, and you need to have a permanent visa, which for many, it is quite a long way to be able to get that. And so for some people, that is a really big barrier if organizations are not necessarily equipped to deal with that. And I think given that so many settlement services do help with employment, this particular cohort needs to be only placed to those organizations that do have inclusion and diversity policies within, and they will be able to really treat them with dignity and respect to make sure that people aren't placed in unsafe situations. In terms of health and well-being, this is the area, I think, where it's really important that settlement services have really clear referral pathways to LGBTIQ+ organizations, in particular to those ones that provide healthcare services, so they're able to provide the gender reaffirming healthcare. We've seen a lot of examples where a woman would come to a refugee or settlement service to use their nurses, for example, and would say that she's feeling unwell. And one of the things they will do for her is pregnancy test, without necessarily knowing that, you know, she may be a person who is in same-sex relationships, and so obviously there's no way she could be pregnant. But those very heteronormative and cisgender approaches to healthcare are not necessarily meeting the needs of people. We also know that unless your doctor or your nurse actually fully aware who you are, what your healthcare needs are, whether you're trans or not, if we're not asking those questions for people, we're not meeting their healthcare needs, because we're just not going to be attending to the most important part that they need. And then obviously trans people need to have access to hormone therapy, and so organizations that are supporting LGBTIQ plus refugees need to be able to make sure that that help is available, or that, again, referral pathways are in place so people can go and access services that they need the most. Another area which is really big for us is housing, obviously, and I think this is where very often a lot of challenges happen as well. So we've had a situation where a young woman was placed in this shared housing with other refugee women, and she started to experience a lot of bullying and discrimination, and that all escalated to the point that her food will get stolen from the common fridge. She will not be able to go downstairs into those shared spaces. And when she made a complaint to the organization, nothing was done at all to address the situation. And so she was still on bridging visa, she was on SRSS payments, and she had to move out completely out of that place and go into private rental, obviously paying you know, so much more, almost all of her SRSS payments for that, just to be out of that unsafe situation. So I think this is, again, without when services are not asking people who they are, you know, what their preferences are, you know, what their identities are, there's always a risk that people are placed in those unsafe settings. When we do talk, for example, to the Department of Home Affairs, you know, we are talking that it is really important to think where LGBTIQ+ people are living, especially when they're resettled to Australia, because, you know, urban places would have more access to them to relevant services and community, for example, compared with regional, where in general there is a little bit of lack of services. But we also have to be asking people whether they do want to live in suburbs amongst their members of their ethnic communities, or maybe for some it is actually a really unsafe situation. And we do see people who actually have to make a choice between being out as LGBTIQ+ person and getting support from the community. And those who are choosing to get support from ethnic communities, in most cases, will choose to never come out. out of fear that they may be again discriminated against and may have to experience a lot of violence within the communities. The family and social support is also really important, and I think this comes back to the whole conversation about visibility of LGBTIQ plus people. We have so many people again who say that they're not part of their ethnic communities because of either real homophobia and transphobia that they experience, or perceived because they think that the community will not be supporting. And I'm sorry if you hear my dog barking at the background. So I think it's important that settlement services do work with ethnic communities, with their client base in terms of the human rights and equality for everyone. And I think we should not have those terms and conditions applying to who we're supporting and who we're not, because we won't be able to get rights for all refugees if we are not including those who experience more marginalization. And so the last, I guess, point from the justice outcome, from the settlement outcomes, is to talk a little bit access to justice. And I foreshadowed the name change and gender markers. I think this is important that their work is done and people are helped. A lot of LGBTIQ plus people in general are really willing to change their names. For some who are trans people, for them that's important, so their name reflects who they are. But also for many, because of the lifelong oppression and persecution, and where societies and families try to fit you into those very patriarchal and rigid norms, many want to start their lives, I guess, anew, and to have names chosen and reflected, who they are. But I also think that within refugee spaces, we also need to be paying a lot of attention to other issues of discrimination, especially in employment and tenancies, but also to be attentive to family law as well, looking into those, if people have to separate. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that also exists that LGBTIQ plus women, for example, could never be married. And, obviously sometimes there are arranged marriages and forced marriages. Sometimes just the whole societal pressure pushes women to be married. And then later on, they understand that they cannot go on like this anymore. And so that access to family law assistance is really crucial for them in Australia. And so, another quote, a woman said, so as I had to hide my real gender identity, being unable to transition as a transgender woman. And so this was the reason for her to seek safety in Australia. But then in here, it took her some time to be able to change her documents, and that documents would reflect her name and her gender marker. And, sometimes she said, some of the barriers she was experiencing was as simple as going to, for example, a bar where they have to check your ID that you're that you're adult, because her passport wasn't showing the correct gender and her name. So in my last couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about what services can do to improve their service provision, and I'm really happy to expand on anything at the end, at the Q&A section. So first one, of course, we have to be embedding intersectionality in our work. So as I said, we have to make sure that we are leaving no one behind and that our approaches are really tailored. So this can be done through data collection, which of course have to be done in safe ways. And sometimes I understand that some services are not necessarily comfortable in terms of how they are collecting that data, but there are different ways without necessarily maybe asking people, so are you LGBTIQ plus, to work with it. And as a FDPN, we're always happy there to assist people to draft those questions and to see how they can be implemented. It's really important to have information for LGBTIQ plus clients that your services are inclusive, that people are not going to be discriminated, and also to have internal policies. And I'm going to show you 2 examples, and I have no associations with these services. I've just Googled to see what was coming up. And as a really good practice example, so this is Advanced Diversity Services, who had a very specific page that talks about LGBTIQ plus people, and they say that we welcome all people regardless of their age, ability, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, language, culture, or religion. And I think this is important because as a client, go on the website, you see that, and you definitely know that things will go well for you. Or for example, this service, ISHAR, Multicultural Women's Health Service from Western Australia, also explicitly says that they are an LGBTIQ plus friendly service and welcomes women of every sexual orientation or whoever identifies as a woman. And this is really brilliant examples for us to see. So another thing I think that is really important is those client-centered approaches. I do quite often trainings and professional development for services, and sometimes I was asked, so I'm so busy, we're so under-resourced, which means, you know, can we, like, I have no time to ask those questions. And I think, you know, unless we actually take this couple of minutes to ask those questions, we're not necessarily supporting those people at all. So again, talk to us if you want help with that, but, you know, unless we're supporting everyone, we're not supporting anyone. So another one is co-design. It's really important that both those narratives and also, you know, services are designed with a particular group. I see some organizations now have the LGBTIQ plus refugee groups they run, and it's really important that you engage people from that community into designing those support programs so they really match the needs of this community. And then lastly, training. Training is really important, and it's really important that every single person within your services are trained to do so, because sometimes people train one person who becomes an LGBTQ plus liaison officer, and that's great, but then what happens if that person calls in sick today and somebody else comes in and they have nothing, don't know how to deal with that? So FDPN offers training and professional development for organizations. I also want to flag that currently we're developing an online module on inclusive service provision for settlement services and LGBTIQ plus services. The module will go live in the middle of 2021. It's going to be free and national available. So please keep an eye, sign up to our newsletters so you can go and do that service. And I just want to flag that it's funded by the Pride Foundation, and we're really thankful to Migration Council of Australia for providing us a platform for their training to be possible. So I'm going to leave it at this, and I'm happy to answer any questions. On this slide, you've got our social media and the website. You can sign up to the newsletters and spread the word. And most importantly, if you do have any clients that are LGBTIQ+, please feel free to refer them to us. We do have people from most of the states in Australia. We have a lot of peer-led support available, and just a community for them to know that they're not alone. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Tina. And yeah, that really provided some insights into some of the considerations that we should have, particularly I think in the context of looking at particular settlement outcomes and settlement areas. So thank you so much for that. Nadine, we will pass on to you now to share a bit more about young people specifically.
Great. Thank you, Sam, and thanks, Tina. That's a really great sort of context, if you like, the kind of bigger picture that you presented, in which I'll share a few reflections and considerations in terms of thinking about how we best support young people who identify as LGBTIQ, who are from refugee and migrant backgrounds. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wadawurrung in southwestern Victoria. So thanks again, Sam, and to MCA for hosting today's event. I was really delighted to be asked to be part of this. It's a really important area, and certainly something that MYAN is seeing in our work that needs much more focused attention than it currently receives. We're certainly concerned that, along with young people with a disability and other identifiers in their lives that are more marginal or unrecognised, that there's an inadequate targeted support to ensure that they receive the support they need, and certainly to which they're entitled to reach their full potential. And as Tina said, to use your language, Tina, live their lives to their fullest potential. Before I focus on some considerations for supporting young people who identify as LGBTIQ plus in the settlement context, I would just like to give a quick overview of MYAN. I suspect most of you are from the settlement sector who've joined us today, but for those of you who don't know us, MYAN is the national peak body representing the rights and interests of young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. We're based in Victoria and we work nationally. We have partners in each of the states and territories, and our three core areas of work are policy and advocacy, youth leadership, and sector development, and we also have some international engagement. So some key considerations for supporting young people who identify as LGBTIQ in the settlement context, so young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. It's really important, as Tina has also covered, to recognise and understand the particular context and experiences in all their diversity of everyone in the settlement context. And I'm going to talk specifically about what some of those particular experiences are for young people. But again, to reinforce recognising everybody comes from diverse backgrounds with strengths and vulnerabilities. And as part of what I'll talk about today, I'm also going to refer to the National Youth Settlement Framework. So Tina, you've referred to the NSOS, those standards, the settlement standards, and I'm going to refer to the National Youth Settlement Framework, which is something that MYAN developed a few years ago, and we've just recently launched, and I'll tease out some particular areas there. And certainly the National Youth Settlement Framework provides some guidance on how we can ensure that this group of young people can access the support that they need. So a little bit about understanding the context and experiences of young people in the settlement context. Young people experience settlement differently to that of younger children and adults. So their settlement experience is distinct from adults and from younger children. And that's primarily because of the age, developmental stage, the role they have in the family, and the role that they play in supporting their family and community in the settlement journey. And they are often carrying a lot of responsibility for ensuring that family members, both younger and older, can access services and support in and outside the home. And we're certainly seeing that really magnified in the current context of COVID-19. In particular, young people are navigating the really significant developmental stage of adolescence in the context of settlement. And this is a really important lens for understanding the particular circumstances and context and experiences of young people, and therefore their needs in terms of settlement services responses. So adolescence is a time of really major change, kind of massive upheaval. Young people are navigating the demands of settling in a new country, in Australia, and the enormous changes and challenges and pressures that come with that, alongside the critical developmental stage of adolescence, where there are critical developments in terms of physiology, mental, emotional, and sexual development. So really, a really significant life stage with enormous changes going on that are happening at the same time that young people are building a new life in a new country. And adolescence is really marked by the exploration of where one fits in the world. So it's a critical life stage considering belonging and identity. And that includes interdependence with family, community, cultural and faith community, and the broader society. So those questions about identity and belonging that are, again, really significant in the life stage. Who am I? Where do I fit? Where do I feel? Where I belong? What are those things that mark a sense of belonging? Who am I? Where do I fit with my family? And in terms of settlement, where do I find those places where I feel included in the broader Australian community? So young people are doing all of this while they're navigating the enormous upheaval and change and transitions of building a new life in Australia. And all that involves cultural dislocation, learning a new language, often, not always, but learning a new language, massive sometimes massive changes, but certainly significant changes in family structures, reformulated cultural and faith community, relationships with peers and developing new relationships with peers, and education, training and employment or career pathways. And some of those things are fundamental to any young person. They just take on a more complex lens in the context of migration, particularly forced migration and settlement. So young people are really navigating complex, multicultural, multi-layered and fluid identities. That's a given. Young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds also commonly face a range of barriers to accessing services and opportunities that are not experienced by Australian-born non-immigrant young people. Some of these barriers are structural. Some relate to the challenges associated with forced migration and settling in a new country, and others relate to general vulnerability to social exclusion at key transition points during adolescence and young adulthood, by which I mean they are common across adolescence, across cultures, across countries, across settings. And adolescence is recognised as a time of heightened vulnerability, including heightened risk of mental health concerns. But it's really important to state, alongside, as I said before, I just want to emphasise again that young people, or this group of young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds, are navigating complex, multicultural, multi-layered and often fluid identities. And it's really important to state that they're not vulnerable per se. They're facing a whole range of challenges, and some more than others. And as I said before, that include really significant structural disadvantage and access and equity barriers that may place them at increased vulnerability, but they are not vulnerable per se. They also have enormous strengths and capabilities, including their resourcefulness, adaptability, diversity, and their multicultural identities. So I think it's really important to emphasise that the multicultural identities that young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds, including, or in particular, those who identify as LGBTIQ, are juggling day to day, week to week, but often they're not recognised, and they're certainly often not recognised as strengths. And young people are often very skilled at navigating those spaces or negotiating those complex identities. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the National Youth Settlement Framework, which can offer us some guidance on and certainly benchmarks good practice with young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. The National Youth Settlement Framework was developed by MYAN. We developed it in 2016, very much in consultation with young people, with the sector and with government. And we recently released a 2020 edition. And it remains the only one of its kind globally. It's a comprehensive resource with guidance and practical tools for applying some of the conceptual information to practice in really practical ways. There's some self-assessment guides and other tools to use in service delivery as well as policy planning. The core elements of the Youth Settlement Framework are active citizenship, domains and indicators. And we use the term citizenship in the broadest sense. And active citizenship has a really distinct focus on empowerment, on building social capital and building agency with young people. There are four active citizenship domains and a set of indicators in each of those domains, and those domains are economic participation, civic participation, social participation and personal wellbeing. There are also a set of 13 good practice capabilities. There used to be 8, and we've expanded a couple and added a few more in this 2020 edition. We've done a little bit more work around a rights-based approach, around reflective practice and an outcomes focus. The Youth Settlement Framework very intentionally draws on good practice in youth work and settlement, and it's very intentionally designed to support a targeted or tailored approach to young people in policy and practice. So in policy and service delivery, design and implementation. And that tailored or targeted approach is the best way to ensure that the needs of young people are met, their rights are upheld and strengthened, and their strengths and assets are capitalised on. So the framework recognises that there are particular experiences for young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds in the settlement context that are distinct from adults and younger children, and the best way to support them to reach their full potential is through a targeted or tailored approach. It's a rights-based framework that sees intersectionality as fundamental to understanding and responding to the context, experiences, rights and strengths of young people. And this intersectional approach is really critical to understanding disadvantage experienced by young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds, and Tina certainly talked a little bit about that. But noting also that disadvantage is shaped by multiple and intersecting markers of identity that includes age, gender, sexuality, ability, and cultural and faith contexts. It recognises the diversity of young people's experiences, and reinforcing some of the points I made earlier, certainly see this as a strength rather than in any way a vulnerability. And I think the onus on policy and service delivery and service providers is to engage with young people, recognising all of those factors in their lives as strengths. So some key messages to guide support on the ground or in practice. And you've probably heard this a few times now, but recognising that the experiences of young people are distinct from adults and younger children. Understanding the enormous developmental tasks of adolescents that are complicated by migration and the settlement experience, and particularly forced migration, and recognising that young people are juggling a lot and intersectional and complex, multi-layered identities, and they're doing that day to day, week to week, while also navigating a range of barriers, some of which are structural. LGBTIQ young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds are likely to be navigating even more complex identities and multiple identities. And again, we certainly see this as a strength rather than a vulnerability. And indeed, it's quite a skill. We know that young people are negotiating multiple identities in a diversity of spaces day to day, week to week. And that can be in school, with their peer groups, with their faith or cultural community, with their family, or within the broader Australian community, and also within whatever their community looks like within Australia and outside Australia. And it's also important to acknowledge that they do face vulnerabilities, and Tina's talked about this in more detail, but there are some specific sensitivities to consider that may not be experienced or exist for their peers who don't identify as LGBTIQ+. And some of these sensitivities or vulnerabilities are that family, faith and cultural community may not provide the safe or protective spaces that they would otherwise provide in relation to other experiences of marginalisation or exclusion, e.g. racism and discrimination, or other experiences of social or economic exclusion resulting from being a new arrival or from an immigrant, migrant or refugee background. And also, as Tina has highlighted and specifically responded to, the lack of targeted supports in the settlement or youth sector. It's important to say that there are some good programs, but it's reasonably ad hoc, and a lot of mainstream youth organisations or programs don't necessarily recognise the complicating factors of culture and faith and the migration experience and the settlement and refugee experience. And certainly in the broader settlement sector, the youth context isn't always recognised. But that's not to say that there isn't a lot of good work out there. I think certainly from our perspective, there just needs to be more of it, and some national consistency is really important. So again, we need to really be responding to a lack of specific and targeted supports in the settlement or youth sector, where there isn't sufficient recognition of the nuances of the experiences of this group of young people. So really practically, and thinking about the National Youth Settlement Framework, what can we draw out of that that is useful in practice? And I'd like to draw your attention to the good practice capabilities, and in particular, the good practice capability, which is youth participation, youth-focused approaches in programming and service delivery, so where young people are the centre of programming, taking a family-aware approach in all the complexity that looks like in practice on the ground, applying a cultural competency approach and using a rights-based approach. And just to talk a little bit more about youth participation, I do want to highlight that in particular because fundamentally that's about working with young people, not just as clients but as partners, and seeing young people as experts in their own lives. I mean, that's probably very familiar language to most of us joining the webinar today, but what that means in practice is really genuinely listening to young people and their perspectives around what they need. And before you get to that point, it's creating safe spaces and building trust, seeing the young person as your primary client, as well as taking a family aware or a family considered approach, asking young people what they need, supporting them to understand and make sense of their experiences, and seeking specialist support. And we all need to address gaps in service delivery. You know, certainly over the last 4 or 5 months, MYAN's held a range of national online meetings and events, and it's really clear that there are some particular groups of young people who aren't necessarily receiving the support that they need, and that includes young people who identify as LGBTIQ and those with disabilities. So, you know, certainly there is a lack of specialist programming and supports that recognise the intersection of culture, faith, sexuality, migration, settlement, age, all of which shape the experiences of LGBTIQ young people in terms of marginalisation and exclusion, and they need to shape service delivery responses, planning and delivery. And sort of my final point is in terms of what we need to be doing to address these gaps in service delivery, ensuring that young people receive the support they need. It's responding to all of this complexity. So often when I'm talking to those in the sector about what needs to be put in place to make sure young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds receive the support they need, often it seems like complex work, and there is a level of complexity, but I think it's really important to say that I don't think it's that complex, and applying an intersectional lens is not that complex. We just need to be really cognizant and responsive to particular sensitivities and vulnerabilities, and we need to embed it into service programming and policy programming and delivery. And responding to this will certainly ensure that this group of young people don't remain on the margins of policy and programming and service delivery. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nadine, and bringing it, I guess, specifically into the context of young people and some of the vulnerabilities that they have specifically. And how we can use the National Youth Settlement Framework to be more mindful of that. Thank you both for sharing. We'll now move on to questions. So please feel free to send through questions through the Q&A box. We've also received some questions through the registration form and through email. So I'll start with them until we receive more questions in the Q&A box. So first question that I have, I'm just going to paste it in as well. Yeah. Okay. Is how can we, as settlement workers, support refugee clients who identify as LGBTIQ+ during the pandemic? What are some specific additional challenges for these clients during this time? and opening it up to either of you. Yes, I'd like to.
I might start on that. We ran a small survey in March at the beginning of the pandemic with people we work with to identify what was happening. And obviously, you know, especially when it was about people seeking asylum and there was, you know, a lack of income support, people were the first to lose their jobs because sometimes they were in those very precarious and informal employments. All of that was really similar to any other person seeking asylum who was experiencing in Australia. But I think the differences were that regardless who you were, you could not go to your refugee or ethnic community for support, you know, being completely figure out who you are. And so that meant that a lot of people were just left on their own, and, you know, they didn't have anyone to rely on. A lot of information that was created on COVID by, for example, all sorts of refugee or settlement services was never inclusive of LGBTIQ plus people. And then all information that was created on COVID by LGBTIQ plus services were never inclusive on visa status. So for example, you know, some specific things was like if trans people were binding their chests, there was some evidence that there could be more at the risk of respiratory infections, you know, hence COVID, because of that. But that will only be information through LGBTIQ plus services. And then LGBTIQ plus services will be all welcoming telehealth as such a great thing, not knowing that some people who are not eligible to Medicare will not be able to use that. So I think that lack of information was in place that, you know, that needed, you know, somebody to sort of collate that and just bring it all together. We've also seen in some instances where they're saying they're going to be supporting the most vulnerable, and they would think of families, heterosexual families with children. And that was sort of further marginalizing this group that, you know, on a, I guess, average day, a lot of them would be very cautious going to services for support. And then now when there was a lot of open rhetoric that, you know, we're supporting this particular cohort, people felt really excluded and marginalized.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tina. Nadine, do you have anything to add to that?
All I would say, Sammy, is kind of the opposite sort of response that you might be anticipating. But we, as I'd alluded to in my presentation, we did ask this question at a number of national events that we held in terms of taking an intersectional lens and asking about these particular groups of young people and whether service providers were seeing them and what their particular experiences were in the context of COVID-19. And by and large, there wasn't a lot of feedback. So I think once again, and as you and I have said in our conversation, Sam, I think certainly for the youth population, it remains a bit of a hidden group. Well, they remain, I should say, they remain a hidden group. So I don't really know, even though we have endeavoured to find out through our work. So I think that says something. That is an alert to us all, really. Who is in touch with this population group, knowing that they do have particular experiences of marginalisation, and in the context of social isolation and complications around service delivery, you know, notwithstanding a whole lot of great practice and services adapting pretty quickly. But knowing that this group face particular experiences of exclusion and marginalisation, what is going on in this current context? And it's concerning if as a sector, we're not quite across that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nadine. Next question is, as a social worker, how do I respond in a more culturally sensitive way with parents who have a religiously inclined negative opinion on their child's sexual orientation?
This is a really great question and a very, I guess, complex one. And I'm not sure whether the rights language, you know, helps, because I think in Australia in general, the human rights language doesn't kind of get us anywhere. But I think, you know, one of the things as I began the webinar, that the sexual and gender diversity existed across all societies. And in so many cases, it was actually colonization that brought criminalization of diverse sexualities and gender identities. And there's so many, parts in history, it was absolutely celebrated. You think about spirited people from, Native Americans, you think about brother boys and sister girls here in Australia. So I think it's about education, it's about providing those resources. And we have a lot of, organizations in Australia that work with, for example, LGBTIQ young people, like 2010 in New South Wales, -18 in, I'm pretty sure South Australia or Victoria. So you've got those places where you can facilitate these conversations and get those resources from them. But essentially, young people are agents. They do have the right to live their lives. They do have the rights to their own choices with regards to their life and their body. And I think that's also what is really important to always reiterate.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tina. Nadine?
I think I'd echo a lot of what Tina had said, including the rights-based lens isn't always helpful in this context, although it's really important to use it as a lens in our work, no question. I think, just to echo, Tina, your reflections on some services that do have expertise in this area, so reach out to them. There aren't a lot of them. And they're under-resourced, we know that, but there is some good practice to draw on. And certainly what we hear from young people is also to try and find, this question I think was particularly around faith leaders and parents, was that right? Or parents with particular faith beliefs, religious beliefs or faith perspectives. Yeah. I think it's important to extend your networks, as workers and services. So go on a bit of intel gathering and a bit of, collegial advice gathering through the networks, both in the mainstream sector and in the multicultural sector, and then those services that sit in between with particular expertise, because I think we really need to draw on some examples where things have worked well. So what was put in place where these conversations were navigated sensitively and well. It doesn't mean there was an immediate great outcome for a young person, we know that. And as you said, rightly so, Tina, I think it's a really important thing to emphasise. This is the case across all cultures. This is not just specific to particular religions or faith contexts or cultural contexts. And these journeys can be long ones over many years. But who can we draw on within faith communities or within cultural communities that might be allies for young people? For you as workers, and also for young people in navigating what might be a long journey.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nadine. So the next question is, we've talked a bit about support for young people and the impacts on young people who identify as LGBTIQ+. But what about for elders or older people who identify?
This is such an important question, because what we're actually seeing is that among those people who either resettle to Australia because of the LGBTIQ+ persecution or come and seek asylum on shore, most of them are over 25. And I think there is a couple of things to take into account. So I think the research from 2016 says that there are about 32 countries in the world where a woman needs a husband's or her father's permission to apply for documents, right? So we have so many still restrictions in terms of freedom of movement for women in particular to be able to leave those unsafe situations. We also know from research that LGBTIQ+ people in general are earning, have less income than general population. So you would have kind of those barriers in terms of financial access to financial resources to be able to live and to seek safety. And so that means that quite often when people do, for example, come to Australia or resettle, then we also have to think how long resettlement now takes. They are already, you know, outside of those definitions of being young people. And unfortunately, I think it's also quite interesting, and I'm not sure whether the issue lies with the fact that we still somehow associate diverse sexuality and gender with being young, that a lot of groups that were at some point popping up were actually targeting young people. And so we have, for example, some couples who came to Australia in their late 40s. And so they've been together for over 20 years. But then, you know, they go to the organization and they have like a peer support group, but it's only for people under 30 years old. And so they feel completely excluded and invisible. And in general, within LGBTIQ spaces, I think there's quite not enough groups for people who are elder. So I agree that that is something that people have to be always aware. And very often we as FDPN will get requests that, you know, people organize various programs in terms of empowerment and leadership for young people. And they'll be like, your clients will be perfect for this. And we're like, well, most of our clients, like 90% are over 25 and, you know, close to 30, so that wouldn't qualify. And so I always try to advocate for a bit of flexibility in there, because this is a particular cohort that they just don't have that many equal opportunities, you know, to come here and you know, and be part of you know, the cohort that is considered as young people.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tina. Nadine, did you have anything else? Sorry, I just realised I didn't. No.
No, but may I just jump back into your other question, Sam? And it's, I'm going to preface it by saying, as controversial as this may be, in terms of supporting young people, and part of that support being engaging with family members, I think it is important to say that if young people are unsafe in their family environments because of their sexuality, then sometimes moving out of the family environment can be, in the long run, a positive move. And once again, I know that can be very controversial, and it's certainly not something that we advocate in terms of the significant implications on family relationships and family structures. But sometimes, and we've certainly seen it, sometimes if young people are outside of that family environment, then the relationships are more positive, and there's a bit of different kind of breathing space for family members, including young people, to navigate what might be, you know, complicated or really fraught relationships where the outcomes can be more positive. And I think it's okay to consider that in the context of support from young people. Of course, taking the lead from young people, so making sure young people are guiding you about what they need and how you engage with family members, and if you engage with family members.
Sorry, Samantha, I'm going to jump in that, because what just came to my mind, and I said in the chat box, there's a really beautiful memoir by Samra Habib called "We've Always Been Here." So she was a Pakistani refugee who was resettled to Canada with her family, and then later in life she came out as queer. And she navigates really beautifully in her book the family relationships and what it meant, you know, within her culture, within her community. It's a really beautiful piece of writing, and I think it also probably will guide more people, you know, because you are within those communities and traditions. But I would agree with what Nadine is saying, because I think at the end, LGBTIQ plus people, and there's so much research about, you know, so much more worsened mental health outcomes and depression and suicidal ideation when they're not supported, when people are not supported at schools, in their families, workplaces, and when we're just letting people to be who they are. I think those create such a powerful outcomes for them in terms of their well-being.
Absolutely.
And sorry, Sam, just to add on again, I think, Tina, I think what we also know is sometimes the what I'm going to call mainstream, but that's really a very simplistic label, really. But the mainstream LGBTIQ communities may also not be safe spaces for those from culturally diverse and migration diverse backgrounds. And again, we know from young people over many years who have said that sometimes they were not safe spaces, there was pressure to come out, and they were very clear that that was not on the agenda for them, and what they chose to do, and actually the support that was provided to them was support to navigate this, was to not come out to their family until much later, over years. And actually what they did, and I guess it's an example of what I mean when I say navigating multicultural identities and those different sites and spaces. Young people already do that regardless of how they identify in their particular experiences. But for LGBTIQ young people, they may be LGBTIQ and comfortable with that identity in some spaces and not in others. And that's the navigation that they do for many, many years until there may or may not be a right time to come out to family members. Yeah, and I think that's important to remember. There is no one journey here, and that's, we need to be supporting everyone in all their diversity and their particular experiences, and supporting them to understand and navigate that journey through their own sense of agency and empowerment.
Absolutely. And I think Tina touched on this about the whole client-centered, how important it is to be client-centered. Absolutely. Thank you both. Next question, slightly a bit of change of pace, is other than adapting our casework documents to be more inclusive, for example, saying gender rather than male or female, and displaying the rainbow flag at all entrances to the building, what else can be done that clearly states acceptance? So this is as a service provider, what more can be done yeah.
This is a really great question. So I think before we're displaying rainbow flag, we need to make sure that staff is trained, because simply displaying rainbow flag isn't enough, that, you know, within the service support will be respectful and inclusive of you. So that's important. Another thing which is really important to so many people are gender neutral bathrooms. So if you have multiple bathrooms in your offices, you know, some can be male, some can be female, and some can be gender neutral, because for people, that is something really crucial. It's important that your organization also has a really visible public stance on issues. And, you know, I've shown you examples in the slides when somebody just says on their website, we are inclusive of LGBTIQ+ people. And so, you know, before you approach them, you would research them and you would know that this is a safe place. Same goes for recognition of LGBTIQ+ people publicly. So for example, this year, the Refugee Day was 20th of June, and the whole of June was the Pride Month. And it was really interesting to see how much, for example, content was there on refugees from settlement services, but almost none of them were actually recognizing the existence of LGBTIQ+ people. And very often all of those conversations are very focused on sort of a single story about who can become a refugee without recognizing sort of a broader, you know, other parts of the protection grounds that people can seek asylum. And then the same was for LGBTIQ+ services. The whole month was, you know, about celebration of, you know, being queer. You know, everything is so glittery without necessarily recognizing how for LGBTIQ+ people who are here in Australia and for asylum, you know, the life is not always so much about pride and glitter, and it is still about struggle for their equal rights, and you know, that has to be acknowledged. And I think, you know, when people see that, people see those, you know, very visible stances, a commitment to those human rights of everyone, that gives them a sign that, you know, this is a great space. Another thing you could do is you can sign on to the Canberra statements and display that on your website, and, you know, start implementing and changing those things, because this document has now become recognizable and available, and that also is another way to show your commitment to the rights of this group.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tina. And we can include the links to that as well when we send out the recording of this video. Nadine, did you have anything to add on that one? No, next question then. So I think we've spoken a bit about parents and how to support people when parents aren't necessarily on board with their sexuality, but looking more broadly at cultural communities, how do we actually, as a service provider, support a cultural community that struggles with this area?
I guess I'm going to talk a little bit from sort of a personal experience of, formerly being a client and accessing various services. So for example, you go to English classes, and English classes are very often, designed to provide, not only teach you the language, but also provide you with that information about life in Australia. How do you register your car, what's your tax return, all of that kind of information. And I think those are the places where you can actually talk about human rights, you can talk about equality, you can use that, to talk about, issues like violence against women, but also LGBTIQ plus rights, right? You're just providing the information, a space for discussion, and you're telling people that these particular groups exist and, and there is equality. I sometimes think that for me, there is no difference in wanting to make sure that we are eradicating racism, right? That we're treating everybody equally regardless of their skin color, their race, their background. So why eradicating homophobia and transphobia suddenly becomes something different? We're still talking about humans wanting to live their lives safely. And I think as services, we need to be having those conversations, because when services are silent, and I've heard many times when people do not want to engage with a particular issue because they think they will upset someone or they don't know how, the moment the services choose to be silent, they're actually doing more harm than when they tried. And I think at the moment, there are resources available. There are organizations available who would want to work and to help, how to hold these conversations. You can do some series of webinars, of events, of brochures, all of that materials there, because I think we are past, I guess, the point that, we can just be silent on the issue.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tina. Nadine, do you have anything in relation to communities?
Look, not necessarily. I think just broadly again, I think it's utilising who we know with some expertise in this area and drawing on that, and where there are gaps, and we know that there are, I think it's developing some resources that can be shared amongst the sector. So, I think bringing some, a bit more of a spotlight on this and identifying the gaps for you as an organisation, and then how you might address those. And Tina's just given some very, specific strategies, but beyond that, where there are gaps in knowledge and expertise, then what do you need to do to fill that? And it might require a bit of work to do that. Again, I think it is a complex space where some sensitivity is required, but certainly when I use the term complex, I don't mean that it's not unnavigatable. I think Tina's talked about some training that her organisation offers. I think skill up your organisations, identify what those gaps are, and invest in the time and the resources that it might take to build your capacity to be much more inclusive for this population group. And sometimes just responding to the other question around sort of embedding it in casework and other. And again, Tina, you provided some really concrete strategies. I also would highlight again the importance of capacity building within your organisation and training for more than one staff. So if it is in your casework policies and procedures, if you like, then what do staff need to do to act on that? And I guess I would draw people back to sort of some of the fundamentals of cultural competency. Does everybody, and I think we all do actually, always, we need to check on our own cultural assumptions. What are we bringing to the table? And we need to constantly check in on those. So I think that you spoke to in your presentation, Tina, but there's a capacity building or a training piece for organisations, and that's what it takes. It's investing some resources.
Absolutely. And this next question, I think we've already touched on it, but it would be great, I guess, to answer it again more clearly. Is there a certain process or documented framework to follow if your organisation wants to be LGBTIQ plus positive and affirmative?
I guess it also depends where people are located, because if you're in Victoria, you can do Rainbow Tick accreditation. In New South Wales, ICANN has Your Welcome Here project that also is a process to undergo training. You sometimes, you can actually go and do those trainings with organizations like ours, because we're able to bring together both I guess sides of it, the settlement side of it, but also the LGBTIQ plus side of it together. Yeah, and sometimes it is all about your, I guess, will to do that training. Even if this is, through a local LGBTIQ organization, they can provide you with that training that doesn't necessarily, fit in those big frameworks like Rainbow Tick.
Wonderful, thanks, Tina. Nadine, do you have anything on that one?
I think again, and at the risk of labouring some points here, but again, building on a few things that you just said, Tina, but I think it's bringing this from the margins to the kind of centre of our work. So rather than seeing, the experiences are more, what we know are more marginalised population groups on the margins of our own work, how do we bring that into the centre? And I think that's partly what I mean by it's complex work, but we just kind of need to do it. Intersectionality is not that complex. It's actually, in the first instance, it's an awareness, and then it's building capacity to skill up organisations and staff so that these population groups, and by these population groups, and again, apologies for the label, but those groups that we know are on the margins, LGBTIQ plus groups, those with disabilities, for us, it's young mothers and young parents, young carers, bringing them out from the margins to the centre of our work. Because it may be when we do some self-assessment about our work, that we keep them on the margins because it requires some work to bring them in. That's so yeah, I think I would just reinforce that. And it's a bit, I guess it's a call to all of us, and that includes, my organisation as well. Rather than keeping them out here, how do we bring them in? And for us, it's certainly bringing the voices of young people with lived experience into our work. It's just part of what we do. We are working with all of these groups, and some groups will require some adaptation of our standard ways of working. That's what we do, and that's what we need to skill up ourselves to do.
Absolutely.
That's an important point, Nadine, because I think one of the problems is people do not collect data, and so it's really easy to dismiss because on the one hand we have no data, on another hand people do not feel safe to come out, and so we think that the groups are so small. And then when you look at a general statistic on LGBTIQ plus people, and there was some research done in the US where they would estimate in the US up to 6% of their refugee populations are LGBTIQ plus people. And if you think in terms of numbers, this is pretty huge. And I think one of the ways, and there was a question in the chat about encouraging people to come out, I think it has to be slightly different. Some people may never come out to you, and because maybe what they seek from your service for them is not related to their sexuality. They just go there for counseling or for English classes or for health assessment. And stuff like that. But I think what's always important in that, to make sure that whatever you're offering from your services is there available for every client, and that that choice is there. And for example, I remember when you would go to services and they would ask you, so what do you need? And sometimes you come from cultures when you're not accustomed to ask. You can't ask those things because you're going to be seen as, as weak or needy or something. But you also don't know, really genuinely don't know what's on offer. And I think, and then, you know, if you're LGBTIQ plus person and there is something that you need, that will disclose you are an LGBTIQ plus person and you don't want to do that, that puts you in an unsafe position. So I think one of the good practices for services when a client comes in is be like, so here's everything that we do, right? If you are an LGBTIQ person or you know someone, we can refer to this service. If you're a person with disability, we can help you with this. If like, just offer them everything and let them choose. And when they're safe, they will tell you, okay, I need this one. And you know, and that would be the way, without, in a way, sometimes forcing them to come out, but also giving them a full choice of access to everything that is there on offer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tina. Last question, because I am mindful of the time, is where can I find more information about specific counselling or support services for my clients who identify as LGBTIQ+.
I've put some suggestions in the chat actually for that question. Q Life is a really great resource. It's the national counselling line that is available from 3 p.m. every day to midnight. For LGBTIQ+ people, it's a phone and web-based service. National LGBTIQ+ Health Alliance has some tools. And there is also a new website called Hard Chat that talks with LGBTIQ+ and culturally linguistically diverse populations as well. Go to your local LGBTIQ+ organizations in your states and territories, because most of them will have counselling services available, or peer workers will be able to connect and talk with those people.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tina. Nadine, do you have anything else to add? No? Great. All right, well, we might finish there. Thank you both, Tina and Nadine, for your time today and helping to place a spotlight on this very important discussion on LGBTIQ+ migrants and refugees, and how we as settlement professionals can continue to support our clients more effectively. Just one last plug is that FDPN and Migration Council have just released a paper on gender responsive settlement, broader learnings from LGBTIQ+ refugees. So that is on the SETSCOP website, and we'll send out the details as well when we share the recording for this webinar. So thank you all so much for participating. Stay safe and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nadine. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Tina. See you. Bye-bye.